Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Before we get started though, I wanted to talk about the sponsor for today's video, Elderbrain. Elderbrain is a third-party content creator over on the D&D 5e side of things, and they have a history of releasing pretty interesting one-shots, adventures, etc. And they've recently started releasing content for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. They have converted their series of Mindscape one-shots from D&D over to Pathfinder, and because I myself was involved with the conversion process, I can vouch for the quality of those one-shots. The premises of all of them are pretty creative, and we were given a lot of liberty to make sure that these conversions did not feel like D&D one-shots with Pathfinder as an afterthought, but rather as Pathfinder one-shots. Check out the link in the video description below so they know I sent you, and use the code Mathfinder at checkout if you want to purchase any of the one-shots. Of the ones that are currently out, I myself worked on It Still Rises and Veils of Lavender, though again I can vouch for the quality of all of those one-shots. Now let's get back in the video. Today's video is going to be the first in a line of martial optimization videos that I plan to release throughout the rest of this year. So far, most of my content has focused on spellcaster optimization. How to pick spells, how to figure out what spells are right for a situation, how to make sure you're never caught off guard, how to coordinate with your friends on making sure your spells work out well, etc. And I have a whole playlist of spellcaster optimization videos. I haven't given much attention to martial optimization, and that's partly because I strongly prefer playing spellcasters myself. But that's not to say that there isn't room for discussions about martial optimization. A lot of conversations around martial optimization focus on damage first and foremost, and anyone who has played at a relatively tactical table will tell you that that's not all martials can do. Good martial characters are varied, and good martial characters have a lot going for them other than damage. And I thought to kick off this series of videos, I can talk about a topic that is probably the most damage-centric for martials, despite not needing to be: itemization, and specifically property runes. Property runes are definitely an underexplored part of Pathfinder optimization. Online discourse about these runes centers on what the community collectively calls rainbow runes. That is, at level 8, you pick up a plus 1d6 property damage rune. The most highly recommended one is Astral or Flaming, typically. At level 10 to 11, you pick up another plus 1d6 of damage, usually the other of the two between Astral or Flaming. And finally, at level 16 to 17, when you have your plus 3 bonus, you can pick up another such rune. At this point, it kind of doesn't matter which one you pick up. You can pick up Shock, Frost, whichever. But it is generally recommended you pick up the third 1d6 rune. And then at some point, the idea is that you should upgrade one of the above runes, if not more, to a greater version. Greater Flaming being one of the preferred ones. And the reason these are all called rainbow runes collectively is because it makes your weapon look like a rainbow of damage types, because you will end up with something like Fire, Spirit, Electricity, or Fire, Cold, Electricity, etc., depending on the choices you made. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not in any way implying that property runes picked this way are weak. Damage can of course be strong, and gaining an additional d6 of damage all the way up to 3d6 extra damage is obviously very strong, but it is not the full extent of shenanigans and power that property runes can give us. And damage can be very fun. Of course it can be. It's a lot of fun to see those large numbers rolled, and it's a lot of fun to drop enemies to 0 HP faster than you otherwise would have. But damage cannot be the end of the conversation, and I've seen plenty of players who feel like the game forces them into these damaging runes, and I don't really like that. I think property runes are capable of so much more than just increasing your damage, and we just kind of have to look at it through a more holistic lens. But first, we need to try and quantify how much property runes can give us, because plus 1d6 of damage, its value is very, very easy to see. And we sort of have to establish that as the baseline we will compare all other property runes against. So to try and accurately characterize how much a d6 property rune adds to your toolkit, I wanted to do some math, and here is the setup for it. I got a lot of help from a Reddit user on this. They ran the simulations for me, and I am confident about their math. They asked not to be named, though, so they're staying anonymous, but I did analyze their results, made sure that they understood my parameters, etc. The setup was as follows. We were analyzing the difference between a character who has plus 1, 2, and 3d6 worth of damaging property runes at various levels versus one who has no property runes whatsoever. I did not consider the impact of non-damaging property runes because that is really hard to simulate accurately. How do you simulate the impact of a rooting rune, right? My intent here was to see how much of a difference do the damaging property runes cause against having nothing on your weapon, other than fundamental runes, of course, and then later on in the video, I'm going to make qualitative assessments for what other property runes can provide this much value. And one notable thing is that I did not consider the impact of persistent damage from flaming because, again, it made the simulation a little more complicated than it needed to be. This is a legitimate flaw because TTK's turns to kill are going to be slightly faster, with that persistent damage included, right? Because a single crit will have a chance of speeding up TTK. But I think it's okay to consider that a little bit of a wash because there's so many other factors the simulation can't account for. For example, your runes are often going to run into resistances and immunities. Even when you have the greater version of one of those runes, you probably still have other runes on your weapon that are going to run into those issues. So between factors like that, I think I'm okay excluding persistent damage, but if you're not, then in your head, imagine the TTKs I present on the next slide are a little bit faster than they otherwise would be. Persistent damage is not going to hugely increase your TTK. And then we calculated the TTK turns to kill at levels 8, 10, and 16 versus 3 different kinds of fights. A moderate boss fight, a moderate fight with 2 foes, and a moderate fight with 4 mooks. In all of these cases, we calculated how many turns it took to drop the enemy to a kill state, hence turns to kill, how many rounds it took before the fight was over. And in each case, the attacker was a melee fighter trying to deal 50% of the combat's total HP and damage. The 50% threshold was basically our way of representing that you don't need to be dealing 100% of the damage in a combat. In every single party, you're going to have all 4 party members capable of dealing at least some damage. Making you 50% of the damage is a good way of representing that you might be the party's primary damage dealer, but you will never be the party's only damage dealer. That's really never going to happen. And I understand that at this point, some of you might be questioning if this simulation is accurate at all. Why are we not accounting for the impact of a party, for example? Wouldn't having a bard in the party change the odds because now your property runes are hitting more often, so that d6 matters more often? And yes, obviously all of that is true, but it's impossible to make a perfect simulation. The goal of the simulation was to make sure that we can glean some conclusions, and I think these led to some pretty reasonable conclusions with this setup. And here are the results of that simulation. I cannot show you all of the charts that I saw because honestly, there's just a lot of data, but I can show you the highlights reel of that. So at level 8, runed up characters only dropped enemies faster 60 to 70% of the time. And you might read that sentence and say, Mathfinder, are you insane? 60 to 70% of the time is a clear majority. That's not only. And you're right, until we account for the second data point, which is that the average difference in turns to kill was less than 1 round in all 3 types of combat encounters. At its highest, it was 0.75, and at its lowest, it was considerably lower. I think it was like 0.4 or something. This means that the character with the d6 property runes was never consistently a full turn faster in dropping their foes. And when you're not consistently a full turn faster, that effectively means you have a pretty huge chance of not having made a difference with the extra damage. This is especially true in a single boss fight. If your turns to kill is half a round faster, but you're just lower in initiative, you effectively don't have a faster turns to kill. And again, the simulation did not account for things like initiative. It did not account for buffs and turn order and stuff like that. So unless you get a faster TTK by 1 or more, you are not very consistently dropping TTK. You still are. Obviously, with the extra damage, you are dropping enemies faster. It's not going to be hugely faster. It's not going to be something you miss a lot if you don't have that d6 of damage. At level 16, it's a bit of a different story. The runed up character now achieves a faster drop between 70 to 90% of the time. That's insanely, obviously a majority, with no sane person ever being able to say only. And the average difference in TTK here was 1 to 1.6 rounds in all 3 fights. This means that once you have 3d6 worth of property runes and the other person has nothing, you will consistently, in every single type of combat, notice enemies dropping faster and faster, and notice the whole combat come to a close significantly faster. A whole round faster means it actually doesn't matter where you are in initiative, you will always notice that difference. So at level 8, property runes will slightly speed up TPK, but with no consistency and control over it. By level 16, if you have 3d6 worth of property runes, you will consistently, in every single combat, notice a difference. So what are the conclusions we can draw from this? Because right now, all you can glean is, well, property runes speed up TTK. How does this help us evaluate non-damaging property runes? This is how. When considering other runes, use this TTK metric as your comparison point. Can I improve my party's TTK or make us survive longer by at least 1 round with whatever rune you're considering over a d6 damaging rune? Making your party survive an extra round is as valuable as reducing TTK by 1 round because it's effectively the same thing. If you have a slow TTK but you can guarantee you live that many turns, you're still going to win the combat. So both of those count. Or can I worsen enemy action efficiency enough that it feels like I gained 1 extra round? If the answer to either of the above is yes, it's probably just as good as a d6 property rune, if not better, because again, a single d6 property rune never consistently achieves 1 round drop in TTK. It's usually less than that on average. So if you can reliably say that something will increase your party's efficiency to the point that it feels like a round decrease in TTK, it's almost certainly better than a d6. And if it's feeling nebulously so, but still like a speed up, then it's at least as good as a d6. And I will add here, at higher levels, you probably want at least 1 d6 property rune. You really cannot afford to have your TTK get 1 to 2 rounds worse in high level play. That is kind of a disaster. But you don't need the full rainbow set. The full rainbow set got you 1 to 1.6 rounds, but a single d6 from that will still get you halfway there. So you don't need all of your runes to be d6 damaging runes. 1 or 2 of them is more than enough, and you should consider other property runes along the way. With all of these conclusions in mind, with this method of evaluating runes that are non-damaging by comparing, say, how much they feel like they reduce the TTK or increase the party's efficiency, let's get into evaluating some other non-damaging runes. The first rune I wanted to talk about is the Wounding rune, and this is cheating. I just said I want to talk about non-damaging runes, and this is a damaging one, but I figured it's worth talking about this first because it is the most straightforward point of comparison. It deals the exact same damage, a d6, but persistent rather than upfront. And I have seen people just dismiss it offhand because it's persistent damage, and I think it's worth talking about just for that reason. So first, let's look at the worst case, the case where the enemy always, 100% of the time, succeeds their flat check. You deal d6 persistent, they have to take the damage 1 time, and then they make the flat check. And then they always succeed it. Let's pretend they're always succeeding it. This means you will always deal exactly as much damage as a rainbow rune. It's a d6. It's just going to happen at the end of their turn rather than as you hit them. That does make it slightly worse than a rainbow rune, right? Because it's the same damage but delayed. If you had a chance of dropping the enemy up front and denying them their whole turn, 3 whole actions, you will now have foregone that chance. But of course, enemies might not always succeed the flat check. That is a crazy assumption actually, because DC 15 is very high. Anytime they're taking persistent damage, there is a 70% chance of continuing to take persistent damage. And this creates a geometric series. There's a 100% chance that they'll take 1d6 of damage. There's a 70% chance of 2d6, 49% chance of 3d6, and so on and so forth. The average damage taken after n turns after you were inflicted with persistent damage is going to be 3.5, the average of a d6, times 1 minus r to the power of n over 1 minus r. Over here, n is the number of turns after the persistent damage was first inflicted, and r is equal to 0.7. That's 70% chance we were talking about. If you assume n is equal to infinity, you get the true mathematical, quote-unquote, value of persistent damage, which is 11.67. Now, that is a very silly assumption. Combats are never going to last infinitely long. What's the longest combat you ever had? How many times have you had that long of a combat? Most combats are not even going to last 5 rounds. So if we had assumed n is equal to 2, we would get an average damage of 5.95. And if we had assumed n equals 4, it would be 8.87. So a little under 2d6 and a little over 2d6. Now, accounting for this being delayed damage, I would say against long-lasting foes, you get a significant improvement over Rainbow Runes. This is because you're likely to drop TTK by even more, because you're nearly doubling the damage if the opponent lives for 2 turns, and definitely doing more than double the damage if they live longer, unless they get very lucky with flat checks. Against short-lived foes, not as much. They're not going to be alive long enough for the damage to have stacked up, and even if they are, every upfront ping of damage had a higher chance of having dropped them before they got a turn. So between those factors, against longer lasting foes like bosses, wounding is a good rune, and against shorter lasting foes like most mooks and standard enemies, it's not as good. There is also an additional factor though. Rainbow damage can actually stack up multiple times in a round. If you have a flaming rune and you hit the enemy twice, they're taking 2d6 fire damage. That's not the case for wounding. If you hit them twice in a round, they're still only taking the 1d6 persistent damage. So at a baseline, if you make 2 strikes a turn, and on each turn you hit once and miss once, the wounding rune and the flaming rune would do identical damage. If you're hitting twice, the flaming rune is doing more damage. And if you're critting once at the early stages of a combat and then never critting again, then the wounding rune is doing more damage. So there is a bit of ups and downs there. I would say it overall still goes to the rainbow rune just because it's easier to set up a situation where you hit many, many times than it is to set up a situation where you crit near the beginning of a combat and then rarely ever again. But that being said, I think it's fair to consider that wounding runes are just a little weaker than D6 property runes. They're not much weaker, they're definitely still worth considering, especially if your party has other synergies with persistent damage, like that one spell that inflicts the frightened condition on foes taking such damage. Overall, let's say wounding runes slightly weaker than rainbow runes, still worth considering, and a good baseline to start talking about other runes from. Next up, let's talk about the Greater Crushing and Greater Fearsome runes. Why are we only talking about Greater? Why not Standard? Well, the Standard Crushing and Fearsome runes are just level 3 items. I have seen people dismiss Crushing and Fearsome offhand because they don't compare well to Rainbow runes. I don't think that's a fair comparison. I don't think a level 3 item should be as good as a level 8 one. Whereas the Greater Crushing rune is available at level 9, and the Greater Fearsome even later than that, and I think these do compare to D6 property runes and are worth considering, and that's why I'm focusing on that. I don't think it will be meaningful for me to talk about the standard versions, which are obviously just going to be worse than D6 property runes on average. Let's talk about Crushing first, Greater Crushing, since it is the simpler point of comparison. Ignore the Enfeebled 2. Let's just talk about Clumsy 2 for a moment. It gives the enemy a -2 to armor class and a -2 to reflex saves. So let's develop a heuristic at level 9 to figure out how valuable this really is. First, let's assume that after you land a crit, between you and the rest of your party, there's about 4 more attacks coming out, each dealing potentially 21.5 damage. That's on the lower end of damage for level 9. Let's pretend there's no spellcasters using reflex saves for now, just to keep the math simple. It's fair to say that you would have a roughly 15% chance of landing a crit on your turn between the fact that you're making multiple strikes and there are buffs and debuffs going around, potentially. Even if you just assume you're only ever critting on a natural 20, 2 strikes would mean there's a 10% chance of landing a crit on your turn, and presumably you're not only critting on natural 20s. There's going to be some portion of combats where just because there's minions around, you're critting on 19s and 18s, and if buffs get involved, even against bosses, you're going to be critting on 19s reasonably often. So I think 15% is a reasonable heuristic of having 1 crit on your turn. Once you have landed a crit, you have given a -2 to their AC, and again, you would have a 15% chance of changing any one attack while AC is so debuffed. The reason it's 15% here is because depending on if you change crit chance or not, it'll be either 10% or 20%, so it's reasonable to average that out at 15%. Say your friend was hitting on a 9, with a -2 to AC, you now make them hit on 8 and 7, and crit on 18 and 17. That is a 20% differential. If you were hitting on, say, a 12, then your -2 to AC is only making them hit on 10 and 11, but not changing their crit chance, so that's only a 10% differential. Sometimes 10%, sometimes 20%, let's go with 15%. I think that's reasonable. So when you take the combination of those two, the fact that you have a 15-ish% chance of landing a crit, and then there are 4 attacks being made, each of which has a 15% chance of having its outcome changed, you now have a 7.17% chance of making the party deal at least an extra 21.5 damage. Take that across a 4-turn combat, and you have a 26% chance of making the party deal an extra 21.5 damage. An extra 22-ish of damage is more damage than all the combined Rainbow Rune hits you would have dealt in its place would deal. Like, if we replaced Greater Crushing with, I don't know, Flaming, 22 extra damage is going to be more than 6d6s of damage. That is a lot of hits and crits that are needed to have this much damage come out of your Rainbow Rune. So if that 26% chance hits, you are basically guaranteed to shorten the turns to kill because you massively increase the damage. It wasn't an incremental change like a Rainbow Rune would be. And I have to really emphasize, I lowballed the heuristic very severely and still ended up with 22-ish damage. I assumed 21.5 damage per attack, but most martial characters will deal more damage than that. That is a pretty baseline amount of damage. I assumed 4 attacks per round, but a martial heavy party is going to have way more than 4 attacks per round because your own attacks will also contribute to this. Remember, Greater Crushing applies till the end of your next turn, not till the start of it. So it might have been more fair for me to say 6 attacks in a round even. And if you don't have enough martials to be making 6 attacks in a round, well, then you probably have a caster who can target reflex saves, and they would benefit even more from this because a caster's save never has only a 10% differential from Clumsy 2. It's always going to have 4 degrees of success that are active, and thus it's always going to be a 20% differential. So I kept the heuristic very conservative, and Greater Crushing still came out competitive with Rainbow Runes. And remember, after all of this, you're also reducing enemy damage, and Feeble 2 will reduce all melee damage they deal, and that is a nice bonus. You're both getting a chance of massively reducing your party's TTK and meaningfully reducing enemy damage. So basically, the Greater Crushing rune is a high-risk, high-reward rune. Across a combat, there is a legitimate chance it'll make no difference, but when it does make a difference, it'll make a huge difference. It will guarantee to shorten the TTK. This is as opposed to something like the Rainbow Runes where on every single hit, it's making a little bit of difference, and all of those might add up to a reduction in TTK, but they won't always. A lot of the times you won't perceive a reduction with just 1d6 of extra damage. And I have to mention here, Greater Crushing has a lot of synergy potential. The heuristica applied was really conservative. All you have to do is be making slightly more than 4 attacks in a round, or have a spellcaster who asks for reflex saves because Clumsy 2 is much more valuable for them than it is for a martial, or just have some buffs going around so Clumsy 2 is always at 20% rather than at 10% sometimes. Any of these synergies will massively increase your Greater Crushing's value. I've seen people sort of dismiss the Greater Crushing rune for a mix of reasons, and the biggest reason seems to be that, well, it's a crit rider and you're not always critting, whereas Rainbow Runes are hit riders and you are often hitting. Well, Greater Crushing Rune is a rider that comes up less often, but it is going to make a huge difference when it comes up, as opposed to Rainbow Runes, which are a rider that comes up all the time, but the chances that they all add up to making a difference are ultimately about even with the chance that Greater Crushing would have made a difference. And I know a natural counter to this is that Greater Crushing is only a crit rider and Rainbow Runes have hit riders and they also have crit riders, right? Flaming does persistent damage. Frost potentially slows enemies. In my opinion, the crit rider on a Greater Crushing rune is so big that it has the combined value of the hit plus crit rider of most of the other Rainbow Runes. If it helps, maybe you should view the Greater Crushing rune as having 2 crit riders. Clumsy 2, which is the one that reduces TTK directly and thus compares to the hit riders of Rainbow Runes, the extra damage they deal, and then the Enfeebled 2, which pretty reasonably compares to the crit riders of most Property Runes, which are just incremental benefits that are nice to have, nothing crucial to your game plan. I think if you evaluate the Greater Crushing rune that way, it'll be obvious that this is a good rune that is competitive with the Rainbow Property Runes. A mistake a lot of people make is that they compare the Crushing rune to the Property Runes, and of course the -1 is not as good as them, because that's coming from a level 3 item. But once we narrow it down to the rune that you should compare, it's really clear that the Greater Crushing rune is worth the gold it costs, and it is worth the Property Rune slot, and it is competitive with D6 Rainbow Runes. And then the Greater Fearsome rune is stronger than this, because Frightened has a significantly higher chance of making a difference. It doesn't just affect AC and Reflex like Clumsy does. It affects every single check and every single DC that the target has. It'll affect will saves and fortitude saves. It'll affect their skill checks. It'll affect skill checks made against them. It'll affect every single thing, including AC and Reflex. The only slight advantage of Greater Crushing is that Enfeebled 2 might end up mattering, but I would say overall Greater Fearsome is better than Greater Crushing, and arguably that makes it better than a Rainbow Rune too, because I think it's really clear that a Greater Crushing rune is just as good as a Rainbow Rune because they have very similar impacts on TTK and very similar nice to haves on top of their TTK reduction. And then Greater Fearsome is better than that. The next rune I wanted to talk about is probably my favorite Property Rune in the game, the Rooting Rune, and I'll get into why it's my favorite near the end of this slide. People dismiss this offhand because it has a static DC, and I get it. Static DCs do generally tend to be bad because it means unless the item is a consumable, you're going to have a useless thing in your pocket sooner or later, and then you'll have to sell it for half price, and it can get expensive to keep items up with regards to static DCs. But the Rooting Rune's DC doesn't actually matter until the enemy tries to escape, at which point they have already spent 1 action and incurred a multiple attack penalty. When you crit this enemy, they're immobilized for a round and they're Clumsy 1 during that immobilization, and the DC does not get involved. All you need to do is crit that enemy. The DC is only involved once they commit an action to escaping, and at that point it doesn't matter. The DC could be -20 and it would still be good because you took away an action and the enemy incurred a map as part of that action. So Rooting is actually a fantastic rune because it just immobilizes enemies. It is one of the strongest runes a frontliner can carry. I talked about this in my undercosted conditions video. Immobilized is a fantastic condition for frontliners to inflict on enemies because at a baseline, it protects your backliners. The enemy must either just agree to spending an action and multiple attack penalty to get out of immobilization if they want to threaten your backliners, or they just have to commit to spending a round in the front line while also being clumsy 1. The value of this rune is honestly too hard to quantify in an actual TTK sense, but at a bare minimum, it is inarguable that it reduces variance for the party and increases survivability. It means that your wizard can stand back in a lot of combats and simply never feel threatened. You don't even have to stand that far back. You can stand in the 30-foot range if you want and just not feel that threatened, because very few enemies have the reach to hit you at 30 feet away if they're immobilized. And honestly, you could make an argument that in a generic sense, Rooting Rune is not as good as Rainbow Runes, because I might buy the argument that Immobilize does not reduce TTK by upwards of a round, despite the fact that it's such a good condition. But what really makes Rooting so fantastic is its combo potential. The biggest combo comes from reaction strikes. There are a few reaction strikes that already disrupt movement on a critical hit. Standstill, disrupt prey, etc. But reactive strike, which is the most common reaction-based strike, does not do so. Having rooting changes that, because when you reduce an enemy's movement speed to 0, you are effectively disrupting their stride action. So Rooting Rune, effectively you could read it as giving your reaction strikes a crit rider that disrupts movement on top of the fact that your on-turn strikes can immobilize enemies. And that is just so fantastic. In fact, it is better than disrupting movement, because let's say an enemy is moving away from you and going to the wizard, you reactive strike them, you effectively end the action that they already committed to trying to get away from the wizard, and now they have to escape if they want to continue moving, or they have to turn their attention to you. This also pairs exceptionally well with any form of on-crit movement. For example, the club and polearm critical specialization effects, they really magnify the power of Rooting Rune, because now you could crit someone, move them a little further away, potentially out of their melee reach, and now you might have put them in a spot where they can't use a melee attack against anyone, not even you, without first escaping. And a lot of people dismiss this potential because they argue that in higher level play, enemies with higher reaches become more and more common. And that is true to some extent, but there is a bit of a misconception there. First, reach is not based on level. Reach is based on your size if you're an NPC. Medium creatures will usually just have 5 feet of reach until all the way up to level 20, unless they have some kind of equipment like a whip or a polearm, making it longer than that. And in that case, you will diegetically be able to see that reach increase and account for that. Larger creatures will typically have 10 to 15 feet of reach at the high end, and then gargantuan creatures are the ones who get upwards of 25 feet of reach. It's not about the level the characters are at, it's about their size, and that means you can just predict how often your immobilize is going to matter. You can see the enemy's size, and that will help you determine, is it even worth going for this combo? And a lot of the time it is. Medium and large creatures are going to be fought all the time, even in high level play, and they will have their options disrupted because many of them have 5-foot reaches for useful options. Even large creatures, even huge creatures, typically have at least one attack at a 5-foot reach. For example, a monster might have a Jaws attack with a 10-foot reach, a Tail attack with a 15-foot reach, and then Claws with a 5-foot reach, and Claws is their only agile attack. So simply by moving them 5 feet away and then immobilizing them, you have made it impossible for them to use their agile attack, and even that incremental benefit does matter. But of course, because enemies might have reach, your own ways of getting reach can pair really, really well with Rooting Rune. This especially matters for reaches beyond 10 feet, like Lunging Stance, or Enlarge, or Giant Instinct Barbarian, all of these when combined with a pre-existing reach weapon, giving you a 15-foot of reach. Every single 5-foot increment of reach does matter. I have seen some folks say that 10 to 15 is not a meaningful jump in reach, but it is, because it makes it that much more likely that either an enemy just has no attacks that can get to you, or even if they do have some attacks that can get to you, it's still harder for them to use their ideal attacks. Like they might not have their agile attack, or they might not have their most damaging attack available. I have seen every 5-foot of reach matter, even in fights against creatures like the Froghemoth, who have insane reaches, because that 5-foot increment makes a difference on whether they're able to swallow you or not. And this combo potential is why the Rooting Rune is my favorite rune of the bunch, because I have played a fighter at level 12 using Lunging Stance in combination with the Rooting Rune, and the results were disgusting. Off turn, I was basically a buzzsaw that prevented the GM from ever threatening someone I didn't want threatened. A 15-foot of reach effectively meant that in indoor environments, it was impossible to get past me without triggering reactions, and even in outdoor environments, I could still put up a good wall of control. And I think this combo potential is what really puts the Rooting Rune at the top. I think without going for specific synergies, it's still a good rune because Immobilize is a fundamentally good condition. But with a little bit of build around, it becomes an exceptionally good rune. And it's really great that you don't have to keep spending gold to upgrade it to keep the DC up, because even without the DC scaling, it is still the best rune in the game, in my opinion. Next up, let's talk about the Ashen rune. And while I do consider the Rooting Rune to be the most powerful rune in the game, between levels 8 all the way up to 20, Ashen rune might outperform it for specific level ranges. The reason it's specific level ranges is because it has a fixed DC, so it is going to fall off when you outlevel it. In the level 9 to 11 range and the 16 to 18 range for Greater Ashen, it is incredibly good. The baseline for Ashen is that it deals 1d4 persistent damage, which is a little bit weaker than Wounding, and Wounding was established as worthwhile, but a little weaker than Rainbow Runes for its 1d6 persistent damage. So at a baseline, the Ashen rune is weaker than that, and perhaps not worth using. But what makes it fantastic is that it can confuse enemies in those level ranges. The confuse scaling is a little wonky. The enemy makes a save every time they are hit, and then if they fail to save, they become confused. And confused is a very, very strong condition, as I talked about in my undercosted conditions video, but I will re-summarize the arguments here. People over-focus on the friendly fire aspect of it and imagine the worst case where you randomly don't end up triggering any friendly fire for the enemy, but honestly, the friendly fire kind of does not matter. The real awesome part of the confused condition is locking enemies into basic strikes and cantrips. That means no grab, no swallow hole, no dangerous spells, no reaction, literally nothing fun for the GM. And that is what makes this rune so good. When you're a marshal using the Ashen rune, every single hit you make has a chance of confusing the enemy. It's not a high chance, and it will fall off as you level up, but it's still a chance, and it is so good when it happens. And you still get a little bit of damage, even if that passive chance doesn't end up panning out. Generally, property runes with a fixed DC don't tend to be worth it. It's not worth going for something that's a DC 25 save, because in 2 levels, that DC 25 is going to be irrelevant, and soon enough, enemies will succeed on like a natural 2. But this one is so good that it is worth it, even if you just drop it later. It's worth the price of buying it, out-leveling it, and then just selling it or just keeping it in your back pocket to upgrade later to Greater Ashen, and it is just worth that gold cost. And honestly, it might even be worth not dropping it. It does deal a little bit of extra damage, and because the save is triggered on a hit, not a crit, you might end up confusing enemies by just like fishing for them to get a natural 1 or natural 2, even when the DC is very low for the enemy's level. So the Ashen rune is a very powerful rune. At the level ranges its DC is relevant at, it might even feel oppressive. I have even seen some people talking about banning the Ashen rune at their tables. I personally wouldn't recommend banning it because at the level ranges it is available, it's not that hard to confuse enemies. Like by level 9, Confusion is an easily accessible spell for spellcasters, and it has a higher chance of confusing foes than hitting and then expecting them to fail a save does, versus just failing the save in the first place. And then by the time Greater Ashen rolls around, casters have access to spells like Confusion 8 and Phantasmagoria, which are AoE confused options, and these are multi-target confused options, which are again each individually more reliable than any one hit from the Ashen rune. So honestly, despite some of the negative discourse surrounding it, I wouldn't recommend banning it. I think it's fun and interesting for a player to have access to this rune, And I think, honestly, any property rune that's not a rainbow rune should be encouraged rather than banned, even if it feels a little annoying to play against as a GM. Next up, I wanted to talk about the extending rune, which might be the single most underrated rune in the game. For the low price of not having an extra d6 of damage, because that's the opportunity cost being compared here, you get to use melee strikes at a 60-foot range. Why do more people not talk about this rune? This rune is insane. The big disadvantage of operating at range is always doing less damage than melee. This is just true in Pathfinder. You could check out my range versus melee video linked above, but generally, the on-paper damage you will do at range is less to make up for all of the tactical advantages of being at range. This is also true for player characters who swap to backup weapons. Your strength character swapping to a thrown weapon took a damage die decrease. Your dex character swapping to a bow took a decrease in the flat damage that strength would normally add to their damage. And that's not mentioning class features and class feats that you might have picked that increase your damage only when you're in melee and not at range. And that's definitely not mentioning that the weapon you swap to might not have kept up in rune progression with your main weapon. Like, if you swap from your +2 greater striking Fauchard to a +1 striking thrown weapon, or a thrown weapon with a potency crystal, that is also a sizable loss in damage. Now, this damage loss is still often worth it for the tactical advantages being at range offers. You might do an opening salvo that tries to convince an enemy to close into you, right? Well, extending rune just makes your opening salvo significantly more damaging, and that is fantastic. I know it has a 2-action cost rather than 1 action, but in my opinion, that is a no-brainer. In that opening salvo, you would have spent an action to swap to your backup weapon anyways, because think about it, what are the primary ways for a melee martial character to operate at range? Swap to a backup weapon and then make a strike with it, which is 2 actions. Use a cantrip or a focus spell at range, which is also typically 2 actions, or use the extending rune, which is 2 actions. So the 2-action cost is a no-brainer, provided that it's only happening for that opening turn. If it happens turn after turn, then yes, the 2-action cost is heftier than swapping to a backup weapon, but at that point we're overcomplicating the discussion because there's probably a good reason this cost is happening turn after turn. Maybe you're fighting an enemy you don't want to be in melee with. Maybe you're in an exceptionally large battle map and this is just an exceptional situation that hurts your character. But in 90% of cases, the action cost of extending is not going to be any higher than swapping to a backup weapon, and in fact, you might end up gaining actions if you force the enemy to close the gap. The whole reason to swap to backup weapons is trying to convince the enemy to close the gap with you while you yourself are not losing that much tempo. But depending on your party's makeup, you might not be that threatening at range. Like, a party that's all melee characters and like a bard supporting them might not be very threatening at range at all. But if you have an extending rune, suddenly that's not true. Suddenly you're about as damaging at range as you would be in melee, and that is a terrifying prospect for most enemies and might convince them to just close the gap and try to bring you down. This is a great example of how altering the tempo slightly with certain decisions can massively impact the outcome of a fight. And of course, extending is a great anti-flying tool that reduces the reliance on caster cheerleading. I've seen a lot of folks say that around level 7 or so, martials should start relying on spellcasters to help them fly against flying enemies, and in my opinion, that isn't really the most efficient way of doing things, because unless you got a chance to pre-buff, your party is going down on actions to help get you into melee, at which point it might just be better for them to do what they want to do and just not worry about you being in melee that much, just ask you to swap to a backup weapon. A lot of times casters will help their melee allies get into melee because of party etiquette, but that doesn't mean that casters should be relegated to cheerleading, and you should still be choosing items to help them out. And extending runes are one of the best ways of doing it. They have effectively double the coverage of the Emerald Grasshopper. Now, of course, it's not like the Emerald Grasshopper does not have its own advantages, but I'm just saying the extending rune does cover a much larger distance. I will also note that at the levels that extending runes first become available, Non-ancestry flight effects are pretty limited in use. Things like winged sandals or the winged rune are only available once a day. You don't get them all the time. So while you might spend the gold to have those on hand, they're only going to matter once or twice in a given day, and it's still a really good idea to have the extending rune available in a campaign where you expect to fight flyers reasonably often. And of course, buying the extending rune will save you both the gold and the slot on whatever options you were considering for flight. Instead of winged sandals, you might spend that gold on boots of bounding. Instead of a winged rune on your armor, you might have a size changing rune, etc. And by the time flight becomes plentiful and easily accessible, Crater Extending has a range of 120 feet. That is such a huge distance that no one except a monk with a flying speed has the same coverage as you when it comes to anti-flying tools. So in my opinion, the Extending Rune and its greater cousin are both fantastic. They help improve your party's tactical viability in a wider variety of fights. They're a great anti-flight tool, and the opportunity cost for them is not that high. It's hard to compare TTK for something like Extending versus the d6 of damage that Property Runes give you, but I think it's really fair to say that a rune that lets you melee at 60 feet is gonna have as much of an impact on your TTK and action efficiency as Rainbow Runes normally would. Next up, let's talk about the Grievous Rune. And the Grievous Rune isn't really one rune, it's 15 wearing a trench coat, pretending to be one rune, because each weapon group has a different effect for the Grievous Rune. And many of them are pretty mediocre, like I would say most of them don't really compare to a d6 Property Rune, but some of them do, and those are the ones we'll talk about. First up, the Crossbow. The Grievous Rune on the Crossbow has a very simple effect. You know the bow critical specialization effect, the one that immobilizes enemies and requires an action to get out of? It just steals that. It takes that and adds it to the crossbow's already decent specialization effect of adding 1d8 persistent damage, and that makes it good for all of the same reasons as the Rooting Rune. You immobilize an enemy, it reduces their tactical variety, it protects the backline, it potentially costs actions and multiple attack penalty, etc, etc. I will also note here that between the bow already having this effect, crossbows being able to steal it via the Grievous Rune, and melee weapons being able to steal it via the Rooting Rune, pretty much every martial except for the gun-toting ones should be capable of immobilizing enemies, and that is a great dimension of play for tactical martials that are trying to coordinate with their party, that are not just trying to do damage, damage, damage. Next up, the Brawling and Firearm critical specialization effects. This one puts a -4 circumstance penalty to the Fortitude save that these weapons' critical specialization effects already call for. That save being to determine if they're slowed/stunned 1, depending on if you're using a brawling or firearm weapon. The reason this is good is because this save is already made at a reasonable DC. This goes against your class DC. Even if you're just trained, it would have been okay, and if you had a decently scaling class DC, this was already a good save to be inflicting on foes to make them slowed or stunned on a crit. A -4 circumstance penalty to that save is huge. Mathematically, it's like if your DC rather than trained was master, or rather than master was mythic. That's how big a -4 is. And it is going to feel that impactful in damn near 100% of cases, because when have you ever seen a foe with a circumstance penalty to Fortitude saves? That rarely happens. Trained and Frightened both inflict status penalties, not circumstance. So this is always going to stack with whatever buffs and debuffs the party is applying to this combat, and it's going to feel exceptionally good. And this is also why it's not a problem that firearms can't get in on that immobilized action I mentioned earlier, because it's bows, crossbows, and melee weapons that can do so, because firearms don't need to immobilize enemies to reduce their action quality and potentially take away an action. They can just ask for a save and just take away a reaction and an action via stunned 1. Next up, there's the Polearm. The Polearm's default critical specialization effect is moving enemies 5 feet, and the Grievous Rune adds another 5 feet to that. And notably, Polearm movement does not need to be directly away from you. It can be if that's what's tactically advantageous, but it can also be laterally away from you. So you can use this 10 feet of movement in many different ways. If you attack an enemy that is 10 feet away from you, you might push them back by 10 feet, and now they're 20 feet away from you, making it that much harder for them to retaliate against you without first spending an action moving in. If an enemy is near a friend, you might park yourself in a way where when you crit, you drag them laterally away from your friend, and that way you rescue your friend out of a pretty scary situation, potentially even out of a reactive strike. So the polearm with the Grievous rune is a fantastic tactical option. A clever player who knows what they're doing with forced movement can really get away with a lot of stuff if they just pay attention to the battle map and figure out where they want their enemies to be. Additionally, there is a lot of combo potential here. One obvious combo is with the aforementioned Rooting Rune. When you crit an enemy with the Rooting Rune, you immobilize them. If you're doing it on a polearm, you're doing it from 10 feet away. If you then move them another 10 feet, they're that much more likely to be forced to use the escape action. And that'll make the Rooting Rune feel even better. I would say that Rooting plus Grievous on a polearm definitely outperforms 2d6 worth of damage runes. Further combo potential of this might be limited by your GM's interpretation of forced movement rules. If they allow the polearm to move enemies around into, say, hazards set up by your spellcaster, it'll be fantastic. If they don't, then it'll be awkward sometimes, but otherwise still a tactical, powerful option. The forced movement that has no GM interpretation, though, is on the club. At a baseline, the club will move enemies 10 feet only directly away from you on a crit. This makes that 15 feet if you have the Grievous rune. Now, unlike the polearm, you have less tactical maneuvering ability with it because you can't use it to reposition an enemy around yourself to rescue a friend from their reach, but you can still push enemies directly away from you. And 15 feet is a large amount. It's likely to force the enemy to spend an action to close in. Again, there's combo potential with the Rooting Rune, though not as much as with the polearm because lateral movement versus only directly away. But the club will unconditionally have combo potential with hazardous effects set up by the environment or by the spellcasters. There's no interpretation here. Every reasonable interpretation of the force movement rules will allow the club critical specialization effect to move enemies off ledges, into walls of fire, into corrosive muck, etc. So I would say the club is comparably good. Less tactical benefits because of the lack of lateral movement, but more combo potential because of the sheer amount of movement being inflicted, as well as the fact that it's always directly away from you and removes ambiguity about force movement rules. Next up, the hammer. The hammer's critical specialization effect is very similar to the club's. It is 5 additional feet of movement, but rather than going from 10 to 15, it's going from 0 to 5. That's because the hammer's baseline effect is a saving throw to potentially knock the enemy prone. And obviously the hammer effect is good at a baseline without the Grievous rune because prone enemies, that's good for the party. Moving them 5 feet away is actually a pretty decent thing to do as well. I don't know that I'd say the Grievous hammer rune is as good as any of the other Grievous runes I talked about on this slide, but it's still worth mentioning because knocking an enemy back and then potentially knocking them prone has a lot of advantages. It brings some of the combo potential of the club by potentially moving them in hazardous areas, because again, no ambiguity here. The hammer is just pushing the enemy. And then you might end up knocking them prone in a pretty dangerous area. Like think about using a hammer to knock an enemy 5 feet back into a spell like Corrosive Muck. That is pretty devastating. That might single-handedly win the combat. So the Grievous rune on the hammer is pretty good, though I'd say overall still not as good as these other 4 runes. I should also mention here the flail. It has theoretically the same effect as the hammer. It just moves the enemy 5 feet, but the flail has the weird restriction where it has to be lateral movement. You are not allowed to move the enemy away from you, only left, right, or diagonally towards you. They cannot be moving away from you at all. I think that makes the flail considerably worse. Remember, the polearm has the option for lateral movement, but it can always move enemies back if that's what's advantageous. The flail will force you to move enemies laterally, and thus is not really worth the Grievous rune in my opinion. The flail's crit spec is good on its own, and you should put other runes on it. The hammer is actually worth considering with the Grievous rune. And all of the other options than the hammer that I mentioned here are all fantastic and definitely worth considering over even a D6 rainbow rune. Now for some honorable mentions. These runes are all still very good considerations in my opinion. They're only in this slide because I couldn't find enough to talk about them to justify giving each of them their own slide. First up, the Cunning Rune. The Cunning Rune is a pretty simple one. When you first hit a target with the weapon, so long as that target bleeds or has something similar to blood, like an oil spill for a construct, you get a free recall knowledge attempt. And this is pretty good. It might seem underwhelming at first because, say, a Rainbow Rune is something that comes up again and again throughout the combat, but Cunning will only happen once per enemy. And yeah, you might get it repeatedly by then attacking other enemies, but once it's later in combat, the recall knowledge loses value fast, right? Even so, I think it's a good rune. It's kind of like the Greater Crushing Rune, where yes, it is going to come up less often than a Rainbow Rune, but when it does come up, it's going to matter a lot. I found that this rune matters the most on Gishi characters that are using a caster chassis as their base. So not like, say, a fighter with a spellcasting archetype, more like a war mage wizard or a druid with the Mauler archetype or something along those lines. Particularly so for any characters already investing in intelligence, like that war mage wizard. Now, I have actually tested this. I played my own wizard in high-level play with a Cunning Rune and a bow. She wasn't a war mage because that hadn't released just yet. I had bow proficiency via being an elf. And I was like, I'm gonna be making third action strikes reasonably often, might as well see what the Cunning Rune feels like. And it felt pretty fantastic. Think of it this way. What is the most baseline question you might ask with recall knowledge? You might ask for the enemy's lowest saving throw. Well, if that's the case, what Cunning effectively reads to you at a baseline is strike the enemy. If you hit, the next spell you cast this turn, the enemy has a -3 penalty to their save, because that's usually what the jump from moderate to low saving throw feels like, right? And then if you miss, no biggie, because it's not hard to avoid the highest saving throw when you're a spellcaster. You don't need to be targeting the lowest, but if the Cunning Rune gives you a free recall knowledge that then succeeds, great, you figure it out. Of course, there is the slight chance you might crit fail, but that always exists with recall knowledge and will shrink more and more as you level up and become more reliable at recall knowledge. And of course, the saving throw stuff is just the baseline. That's not the only recall knowledge question you will ask, that's just the one you'd probably default to. But you might ask questions like what special abilities, what weaknesses, what immunities, and in those cases, this rune is going to shine even more. All of those things are going to feel way better than just a -3 to the next saving throw that you might make. All in all, let's say this rune is still a little bit worse than a D6 Rainbow Rune, but it's definitely worth considering, especially if you were already planning on casting spells. Next up, there's the Quick Strike rune. All Quick Strike does is make you perma-quickened that lets you make a strike with that additional action. Nothing else, just the basic strike action. And the fact that you can only take the basic strike action, not even a stride, may not feel good on paper, but honestly, perma-quickened is inherently good. If there was an item that said you are quickened, but you have to use that action to do nothing, it would still be a pretty good item, because simply being quickened means slowed one does nothing to you, and stunned one only takes away your reaction. It effectively doesn't take any of your 3 actions away. This is extra awesome against petrification effects, and those can be somewhat common in higher level play. It's not uncommon for enemies to be able to do that thing where they slowly make you slowed 1, 2, 3, and then when you max out, you're permanently frozen or something like that. This insulating you against that even further by requiring 4 ticks rather than 3 to take you out of combat completely is fantastic. I think that makes Quick Strike a pretty good rune. Remember, getting an extra action, even if it's just for striking, is good. There are times that you'll use that action to make a meaningful strike. There are also going to be times you use that to make a throwaway strike at map 10. There are going to be times when that strike hits or crits anyways due to just sheer luck, and you had a pretty low cost of doing that because all it cost was a property rune. Nobody had to spend time buffing you to make you make that extra strike. You didn't spend one of your 3 real actions making that meaningless strike, and then it hit anyways. And then insulating you against slowed or stunned on top of that is just great. Obviously, when you're using the Quick Strike rune, you really do have to watch out for anti-synergies. If your party was already using Haste 7 or Quickening Banner, this rune gets worse because it's effectively doing nothing anymore. If you have a feat that gives you perma-quickened, this rune gets worse because it's literally doing nothing anymore. So make sure you watch out for these non-bows, these anti-synergies, but so long as you're careful about them and coordinate with your party, this is a good rune to be considering. Provided it is available to you in your campaign, obviously, it is a rare rune. So far, every rune I've mentioned has been either common or uncommon. Common is always available, and uncommon tends to be very easy to find, but rare tends to be a little harder to justify to your GM, so this might just not be available to you. Next up is the Hooked Rune, and this is another rare rune, and this one is good for obvious reasons. It can give the trip trait to literally any weapon, and that is fantastic. There's a lot of combo potential there. For example, you can now take a gill hook, which at a baseline has grapple and reach, which is devastatingly powerful, and give it the trip trait, which is even more powerful. You now have the agency to choose to trip or grapple enemies depending on what's worse for them and what's better for the situation. You have the agency of grappling and tripping enemies, provided you're willing to take on that risk, and really neuter their capabilities of getting out of there. The Hooked Rune can be a fantastic include, provided you have access to it, of course, as it's rare, on any control-oriented martial character. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking about how cool a Daredevil with a shove plus trip weapon could be if you are building around the Hooked Rune. You could get, say, a Becta Corbin, and you would have both trip and shove available to you at all times to use with Daring Stunt. And lastly, the Flickering Rune. The Flickering Rune is great on paper. It inflicts Dazzled on a critical hit. The literal only reason this is an honorable mention and not a whole slide of its own is because it just loses to the Phantasmal Doorknob, and especially the greater Phantasmal Doorknob, and that is unfortunate. Now, of course, the Doorknob has an access cost. You need to have a spellcasting dedication. You can't even use Trick Magic item to use it. You have to use a spellcasting dedication and have the cast the spell activity before you can use a Spell Heart. And many characters may just not be able to access the dedication. Like, I have built high-level characters that were not able to fit the dedication anywhere on their class feats. In a free archetype game, there's really no reason to ever use the Flickering Rune over the Phantasmal Doorknob, unless the latter's banned, of course. But if you're not playing in a free archetype game, you should at least consider the Flickering Rune, because inflicting Dazzled is great, and not locking yourself into a casting dedication might open other options for you down the line. So it's an honorable mention, gets power crept by a more common item, which is unfortunate. That item might be banned, you may not have access to it, so it's still worth considering. And that is all for the honorable mentions. All of them are good runes, either almost as good as D6 or slightly better, but have some obvious downsides, like anti-synergies with things your party might do, or requiring you to build around a specific combo and not opening up other avenues, etc. And that brings me to the end of this video. How many runes did we cover today that are not rainbow runes? Wounding, Greater Crushing, Greater Fearsome, Rooting, Ashen, Extending, and let's not count Greater Extending separately because I think that's unfair, Grievous, and that's 7 at a minimum, all the way up to 11 depending on what you thought of my honorable mentions, which were Cunning, Quick Strike, Hooked, and Flickering. That was 7 to 11 different total runes that we considered that were all arguably in the ballpark of rainbow runes. Some are probably weaker, like say the Wounding rune, some are stronger, some are generically less strong but have significantly higher combo potential. All are worth considering. And that is kind of the important point of this video. In the optimization community, you're going to see again and again the idea that the game forces you into these D6 damaging property runes, that you have no other choice, that you have to make this boring choice that a lot of people don't like making. Don't just believe that. There are so many good non-rainbow runes. Pathfinder does legitimately have a problem with item bloat, and that sometimes makes alternatives hard to find. There are 80 weapon property runes in total. Even if you ignore everything under level 7 so that we're only in the ranges where rainbow runes are available, that's still 60 property runes in total. That is a lot to dig through, and I understand why so many people come to the conclusion that the rainbow runes are the only good ones, because while you're digging through those 60 or so runes in that level 7 to 20 range, you're going to see a lot of situational and niche and not even that good runes, because of course there are bad items, and the rainbow runes will provide you with some obviously good candidates, and you will just use them, and eventually this myth becomes pervasive that they're the only ones worth picking, but they're not. Today we covered about 11 different runes that are all worth considering, and that's more good non-rainbow runes than there are rainbow runes in total. How many rainbow runes are there that are actually good? The rainbow runes that do vitality and void damage are not that good. There are rainbow runes that only do damage to a specific creature type. Those are not that good either. When it comes down to it, there's like 6-ish different good rainbow runes, I think. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but there's not that many considerations. And then there's at least as many, if not more, non-rainbow runes you should be considering, and really any high-level martial character that wants a little bit of agency in how combat goes should definitely consider some property runes that are not just increasing their damage by d6s. So I hope I have convinced some of you of that. I hope that the next time an optimization discussion about property runes comes up, you link them this video and tell them that no, there are so many good options to consider that are not just adding 3.5 extra damage per rune. If you like this video, please like and comment. If you'd like to see more of my content in the future, please subscribe and click the channel notifications button. And of course, if you'd like to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership or using the link in the video description below to buy one of the Mindscape one-shots. I will get a commission of a portion of that sale. My next video is temporarily going back to spellcaster utility stuff, and I hope to see you in that next video. And then we'll be going full send on the martial character series, and I have a lot I want to share in those. So I hope to see you in all of those videos. Mathfinder out.